Well, good morning, everybody. Let me take a moment and introduce myself, and then I'll introduce my friend here. My name is Matthew Johnson. If you're a guest, my name is Matthew Johnson, the lead pastor, and so honored that you're with us. And we really just hope you feel welcomed here today. And I want to introduce something. This is a strange and also cool moment for me. My son, Cole. This is my son, Cole. It's his first time in the adult services with us. And it's funny. Last night I was giving him a hug before he went to bed, and I was just, like we do, I was hugging him, kind of teasing. I said, tomorrow you're going to be in service, and I'm going to embarrass you, right? And he went, I know. And but you know what? I'm going to do just the opposite. I want to honor him, that he is a special kid. I love him with all of my heart, and everyone that knows Cole knows he is a sweet kid. He loves the Lord. He loves his siblings. He's respectful, and I think you should just honor people where they deserve it. So I just want you guys to meet my son. I love him. He was born on my birthday 12 years ago, so we have a special bond in that way, and so he's here today. And so when I tell stories, your heart can go out to him because he's going to be a part of some of my stories today. So love you, buddy. All right, do me a favor, grab a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, there's some located under the seats in front of you. And we're going to turn to Luke chapter 22, verse 47. Luke chapter 22, verse 47. And then there's another passage that I'll need you to turn to, and that's also Matthew 26. So this reference will be on the screen. You can turn to these, and we are going through the book of Luke, and it's crazy to think about. We started this a few years ago, and we're in the home stretch. And so we have about 5-6 more weeks where we'll be in Luke, and then we'll complete this series. And today what we're going to talk about is a message that I know impacts all of our lives. And what we're talking about is the tension that we have in relationships, and specifically how do we respond to that tension. And the reason I know that it's relevant to all of us is, one, we all have relationships, and two, we all have tension in relationships. And the reason I can say that confidently is because I know that as people, we consistently make mistakes in relationships. As people, even though our hearts are not purposed to do that, we just naturally will do things that are unwise, that are selfish, that are damaging, that are hurtful. I mean, we just make mistakes. Can I get an amen on that? I mean, even though, again, we don't want to, we want to honor people, we want to love them, we just make bad decisions. Here's a case in point. Last Sunday, I was driving home. And I do realize I have so many of my stories have to do with me driving. I want to promise you something. I'm not angry when I drive. I don't have road rage consistently. And so I was driving home, and actually my son Cole was with me. And we were going home, and we were at the corner. I think it's Broad and 6 where that Kroger gas station is. And there was a vehicle in front of me, and the vehicle actually needed to turn left, but because there was a line of cars, it was trying to do a shortcut. So it pulled into, and I didn't know this when it was happening, pulled into the Kroger parking lot and was going to then try to pull out over here because this light was green to go that way. So they're trying to do a quick shortcut. Again, I didn't know that. So they pull in there, I go and I turn, and then they pull out. But the problem is, as soon as they pulled out, this light turned red now, and they blocked the traffic going this way. And so my car had to stop as they went right here. And it was a strangely intimate moment where we're making eye contact with each other, and I had my hand on the steering wheel. And so I did what any Christ follower would do. I looked him dead in the eye and I go, "What are you doing?" And the guy's response was funny to me. I don't even know what he was trying to say, but he pointed and he went, and I was like, "What, like you were close?" or something? I don't know what we're trying to figure out here, but it had me laughing as I pulled around him because I thought, I would have tried that move. That's something I would have done. Because again, it's not, in that moment, I think he realized that was not a wise move. And I thought, doesn't that illustrate us and the decisions that we make? At times we just do things that are unwise and we can hurt relationships. But if we get a little bit more serious for a moment, we also do stuff intentionally. Things that we know can be damaging to a relationship, and we hurt people. And so for every single one of us, all the relationships of our lives, the truth is at times that we let people down and people let us down. So here's the question I want to wrestle with. How do we treat people who mistreat us? How do we treat people who mistreat us? This is the tension that we have to resolve in our minds and hearts, because every single one of us are going to have moments in our relationships where people let us down. Maybe it's intentional. Maybe they're aggressive. But maybe it's unintentional. But either way, how do we respond in those moments? And really the question is, how do we respond in a way that honors our belief system? Because every single one of us has some form of a code of ethics, something that governs how we treat people. And maybe that code of ethics was established simply by the culture in which we live. And so we know what's socially acceptable. We know what's socially unacceptable. And we get this. If how people are raised in America, we respond one way to a situation. You go to and talk with someone that's raised in another country, and they would say they would respond differently. So maybe it's just the culture that we live in, or maybe it's your upbringing. I mean, every family is different. Every family has different dynamics. And so you were trained to respond to people when they act this way, you act that way. And for some of you, I mean, as I say that, you know that your family, they taught you to meet every form of aggression with aggression. Others of you, your family taught you to sweep everything under the rug and never to address any issues. And so maybe that's the system that you've bought into, one of those two ways. Or maybe it's just simply, or what I think majority of us in this room, maybe it's our religion. It's our belief system. It's our relationship with God that we allow to dictate to us how we're supposed to act. Or again, maybe it's just simply the laws that are in place. The reason that I don't respond the way that I want to is I realize it would be illegal if I did. Is that any of you that in your minds you think like the only reason I don't do what I want to do is because I would go to jail? Like, no one's going to admit to that, but I mean, we can all acknowledge that if there were not laws restricting our behavior, there would be much more violence and personal damage and destructive of people's properties, right? I realize as I say that, it makes me seem really violent, but you're thinking the same thing, okay? But we whatever it is, whatever code of ethics, whatever belief system we have, it shapes how we relate in relationships. And so the question that we're wrestling with is what's the proper response? And the reason this question is so critical is if we're being honest, we think these two are connected to each other. We think people's treatment of us and our treatment of them is directly relational. So how they treat us is how we are supposed to treat them. Because in our belief system, we think that every type of behavior demands a response, good or bad. If someone is kind to you, there's a proper response to that. You say thank you, you show your appreciation. But we also think in our culture that when someone comes after us, that behavior demands a response, whatever it might be. It might be to meet it with equal force or even to go greater. It might be to respond in a different way. I mean, you see this in every relationship. You hurt me, I have to hurt you. You come against me, I have to defend myself. So if you're going to yell, I'm going to yell. If you're going to say something, I'm going to say something. If you're going to let me down and not meet my expectations, then I'm going to pout. I'm going to withdraw from you. And you see this in friendships. You see this in family dynamics. You see this in marriages. One spouse doesn't meet the other one's expectation, and so I'm going to withdraw. I'm emotionally not going to connect to you. I'm not going to meet your emotional needs. I'm not going to meet your physical needs because I'm going to pout until you learn to change your behavior. And for some, the response is to end that relationship. For others, it's to quit that job. For others, it's to gossip about them. Or what's big in our culture now for a lot of people, you hurt me, I'm going to post about it on social media. I'm going to be vague about it so no one knows exactly who I'm talking about, so they'll have to private message me, and then I'll tell them all about the situation. And we think that's the proper response. But here's the question. Is that the proper response? Because what we think in our minds is that these two things are connected. That my behavior is directly related to your behavior. And here's a sentence that kind of summarizes this. Here's what we think. If that person will quit doing that behavior, then I will stop having that response. You guys know what I'm talking about? The reason that I yell is because you do that. The reason that I have to pout is because you do that. If you will just quit that behavior, then I will be able to quit doing what I'm doing. How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about? And the truth is that there is a better way. The truth is that our response has nothing to do with the other person's behavior. As difficult as that is, because some of you, even as I say that, you think, no. You don't know my situation. But here's what I know. In every relationship, you can have one person, and they can treat two people in the exact same way. And each of those individuals will have a different response to them. Because the truth is all of us are responsible for our own behavior and our own minds and our own hearts. And this is what we're going to look at today. That these two ideas really aren't connected. That Jesus is going to model for us a way of thinking and living that's so countercultural, it's so against our nature that it will be hard for us to embrace. But what we'll see is that if we embrace the way that Jesus treated people who mistreated him, what we will discover is not only is it best for us, but it's best for the individuals and the relationships we're in. And so if you haven't already, turn to Luke chapter 22. I'll give you a little bit of context in case you weren't with us the last couple of weeks. This is at the very end of Jesus' time here on earth. And so a few weeks ago, we looked at the idea, he celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples. Last week, we looked at the idea that he went with them and he was praying because he was submitting his will to the Father and how difficult that was. Well, where the story takes place today is this is right when Jesus is arrested. A group comes and they arrest him, and a part of that group is one of his closest friends, Judas, who's betraying him. And so this is going to launch into the process where Jesus the next day will be crucified. He'll go through a mock trial, he'll be beaten and brutalized, and then he'll be murdered. And so this is where the story picks up. It says, while he, being Jesus, was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. So in their culture, it was very common to greet someone with a kiss, but in another account of the same story, Judas had told him, whoever I kiss on the cheek, that's the one you know is Jesus, that he's the one you need to arrest. So he drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? So his disciples are like, should we defend ourselves? And again, this is a really understandable response. They see evil coming against them, and they're asking, should we respond in kind? And I'll come back to that in a moment. And one of them struck the servant of the high priest. This was Peter who did this. Struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour, the power of darkness. So in this moment, it's an interesting thing that these soldiers come out, and they come out to arrest Jesus, and here's what's obvious. Their intention is evil. There's just no doubt about it. And this is what Jesus even acknowledges. He's saying, every single day, I'm out and open. I'm out in the public. You could have at any moment come and talk to me. But the fact that you waited till the crowds were not around, until a late hour of night, you come armed with swords and clubs, it shows that your intention is evil. So in this moment, this crowd that's coming to arrest Jesus, their intention is evil. And so the disciples of Jesus, their response is proportional to what's being inflicted upon them. They asked Jesus, evil's about to take place. Do you want us to meet it in kind? They're about to arrest you. Do you want us to pull out our swords to fight and to defend you? And they ask the same question that I think we wrestle with in our own minds and hearts. When evil is being inflicted on us, do we meet it in kind? Do we repay evil for evil? And this is what I love. As they ask the question, Peter, who, you know I love Peter, he's my boy, but Peter does some stupid things. Peter pulls out the sword, doesn't even wait for the answer from Jesus, and he takes a swing. And he misses actually his mark, and he cuts off the soldier's ear, and it falls to the ground. And can you just imagine the perspective of Jesus? This is how I think it played out in my mind, is that Jesus was like, really, Peter? Really? And he reached out and grabbed the ear, and then he popped it on like Mr. Potato Head, pop, healed that guy. And it's like, is this what you think I wanted you to do? Did you really think that in my mind, all that I've taught you over these last few years, that what I want you to do is to kill this man? But when we look at Peter and what he did, honestly, Peter's behavior makes sense. From our perspective, if someone's going to attack you, you attack back. Someone's going to be evil to you, you're evil back. Someone wants to be aggressive with you, you defend yourself. Peter's behavior makes sense. He met evil in kind. And can we all acknowledge that Peter was not aiming for this guy's ear? He was aiming for his head. He was looking to kill this man. And yet he missed, and he hit the side of his face and cut off his ear. And so Jesus heals this guy. But in this moment, when I look at this story, I see myself in Peter. I see myself in the disciples because I think this is what I've been conditioned in my own life through culture, through my own way of thinking, is that we always have to meet evil with evil. And so Jesus addresses this. And another guy that was there, that actually was an eyewitness, his name was Matthew, he has another account of this story where he adds a little bit more than Luke did. And here's what Matthew said in Matthew 26:52. Then Jesus said to him, being Peter, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? A legion is anywhere between 6,000 and 7,000 soldiers. And so what Jesus just said is, do you really think, Peter, that I'm out of control? Do you really think that I couldn't handle the situation if I wanted to destroy them and defend myself? I mean, what he just said is, don't you realize if I wanted to, I could call down 70,000 plus angels in this moment to defend me. And just to give you a little bit of context, there's a story in the Old Testament where this wicked nation came against the nation of Israel, and God sent one angel down, and one angel killed 185,000 men in one night. And so just to give you a little context, Jesus says God would send 70,000 plus angels to defend me if I wanted. And he was just throwing out a number. He could have said any amount of angels. But when we look at this, he says a powerful statement to Peter. And in the translation that we use, it says, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. But many other translations word it this way, and I want to say it this way because it's easier to explain. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. This is what Jesus says to Peter. Peter, in this moment, you repaid evil with evil. You brought out a sword because they had a sword. And he says, but I want you to understand a different perspective. That those who choose this method, this will ultimately be their undoing. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Now let's pause for a moment. Here's what we can acknowledge for those that are in a relationship with God. Jesus is wiser than us. We believe Jesus is smart. He has intelligence. We believe that what he says is true. But when we look at some of his statements, it's hard for us to always embrace it as true. And when we look at this statement, if we try to reconcile this with our culture, the truth is we don't believe this statement is true. That those who live by the sword die by the sword. Instead, I've actually reworked this sentence in two different ways that I think better illustrates what we believe. And here's the first one. Those who don't live by the sword die by the sword. Because, think about it. If you're talking about a literal sense of weaponry, if someone comes to your house and they're armed and you're not, who's the victim in that story? Unarmed person. But we also understand this even in relational tension. Someone comes against you, they're aggressive. They want to verbally attack you. They want to maybe physically attack you. They want to spread lies about you. What we would say is the person who never defends themselves, who never meets their anger with the same type of anger, never meets their aggression with the same type of aggression, we would say that person dies. The person who doesn't defend themselves is the person who is the victim. Or here's another way you could word it. Those who live by the sword live if they're better with the sword than their opponent. That I have to strike first. I have to strike more aggressively. So if you want to come to me at this level, I need to come at this level so that I can end it, so I can be victorious. Because in our minds, the concept of allowing someone to be aggressive with us without us reacting the same way seems unheard of. Honestly, it seems illogical. It seems unwise, and it seems unsafe. But what Jesus said to them is this phrase, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And this is a powerful principle because this is not what comes to us naturally. I had a really funny interaction last night with my family. We're at dinner, and so the way our dinner table is set up, I'm at one end, Mary's on the other, and so the kids were on the other sides and either side. And my daughter Nora was right here, and she said, out of the blue, there was no context for this. She just goes, Daddy, did you ever get in a fight when you were a kid and get in trouble? Like what? A great question, And I kind of look up at Mary. Mary just kind of smirks at me like, how are you going to answer this, Matt? And I was like, yes, I have. And I got in a fight when I was younger, and I got in trouble for it. And she goes, with who? Or one of my kids asked, with who? And what was funny was I actually remember the name. I was like, with David Skirta in 6th grade. And I remember the moment. And so they wanted to know some details about it. I said, well, what happened was David was a year older than me, but he was in a fight and picking on a kid that was 2 years younger than me that was a friend of mine. So a kid 1 year older was picking on a kid 2 years younger. And I went over and I tried to break up the fight. And I was trying to get him to stop. And so when I broke up the fight, David turned his attention to me and he started swinging at me. And so I just kept backing up, and he was missing me, and I was like, I don't want to fight you, David. I don't want to fight you. And then he tried to kick me. And when he tried to kick me, he went like that, and I backed up, and he missed. But the bottom of his shoe went up my pant leg, and it made my pants dirty. And I was like, that's it. And so I hit him, and then I got on top of him, and I started hitting him. And then my soccer coach, who was like 6'8", this huge guy, came and picked me up like I was a football and carried me to the office that way. Can you just picture that scene? I'm like, put me down, And he took me to the office. And so my kids, as I'm telling them this, they're just like bright-eyed, like can't believe their dad's so violent. And so they're like, you got in trouble? I said, yeah. And I said, what was actually funny was my dad went in and he defended me. My dad was like, well, what was Matt supposed to do? The kid was trying to punch him. And they said, Mr. Johnson, it was okay until Matt got on top of the kid. And I was like, fair enough. That's true. And so they're like, is that the only story? And I was like, well, no, when I was in kindergarten. And when I was in kindergarten, my brother Daniel, who was in third grade, was getting bullied by a fifth grader. And so we were sitting in the same seat on the bus, and this fifth grader was in the seat behind picking on my brother. Again, I'm in kindergarten, my brother's in third grade, this kid's in fifth grade. So I did what any good younger brother would do. I got up on my seat, turned around, and I punched the kid in the face. And he never picked on Daniel again. And so the kids were like, whoa. They're like, is that it? I'm like, well, no. In fifth grade, my dad was playing basketball, and I was there with my brother Chris, and this other guy was picking on my brother Chris, and so I punched him, and I actually broke my hand in that one. And it's like, as I'm telling even as I'm telling you, like my kids were like, my dad is so violent, But here's the funny part about it is I jokingly said to Cole, I was like, tomorrow you're going to be in church and you're going to hear me talk about something completely opposite of what I just said about repaying evil with evil. And but the truth is that as I look at that, that is the rhythm of my life. And not that I thank the Lord, no longer am physically violent with people. But in my mind, I've always had a mindset that you repay evil with evil, that you meet the sword with the sword, that if someone's aggressive, you're aggressive back with them. And so it's hard for us to understand a different perspective. But what Jesus was saying in this moment is you need to understand this. He wasn't just preaching straight pacifism. Jesus wasn't saying that there's never a time that you should defend yourself, because we see that there are times that you need to defend yourself. I'm not talking about that today. But what Jesus was saying was actually a deeper principle. And the reason I'm saying he's not strictly talking pacifism is even what Pastor Chris taught on a couple of weeks ago. On this same night where Jesus says to them, those who live by the sword die by the sword, in that same night he told his disciples, if you don't have a sword, you should sell one of your extra garments and go buy a sword. So he's not preaching straight pacifism. What he's teaching is something much deeper. He's teaching about the issue of the heart and our mindset of how we're going to approach people that want to do evil against us. And so here are the three truths that I'm going to show you today. I'm going to just tell you them right now. I'm going to show you a bunch of scripture, and then we're going to come back to them. But the first truth that he's teaching is that you determine the condition of your mind and heart. Jesus wants you to understand is that you determine how you're going to think, how you're going to feel, what you're going to meditate on. And again, I'm going to come back to all of these. The second thing that plays off of that is your heart and mind determines your behavior. How you think, how you feel determines how you act. And then lastly, your behavior impacts the condition of your relational environment. How you think determines how you act determines the health or the potential health for your relationships. And let me show you some examples, because Jesus taught this same principle in many different ways. In Matthew 5:21, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said to those of old. And whenever he uses that phrase, he's talking about the religious leaders. You have heard your religious leaders say this truth before. You have heard that it was said of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. So, every culture, every healthy culture in humanity has always believed that murder is wrong. But he's saying, okay, you've heard this, and so this has been your standard. We are not allowed to murder people. But what Jesus is about to do is he's about to take it deeper and say, but if that's your standard and then everything below murder is permissible, what good is that? And so he's going to address it. He goes, you've heard it said, do not murder. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. And what Jesus is saying to them is, guys, if all your focus is never breaking this ultimate command of do not murder, then you're missing true value of what I'm calling you to do in your relationships. Because what he's calling us to do is to actually examine the condition of our hearts. He says, I don't even want you to be angry. Now, here's what we know. Anger is an emotion. Sometimes you can't help it. It just happens. You don't think about it, you get angry. But what Jesus is actually talking about is the condition where we meditate on that anger, where we allow it to play over and over in our minds and hearts. You guys know what I'm talking about? When you start having imaginary arguments with people, right? Arguments that you win every single time. We all agree, like in your mind, when you have this argument, when you get done, there's always a crowd, and the crowd's always like, they start slow clapping you because of your brilliance, and you win the argument. The person bows down. I'm so sorry. Will you ever forgive me? I pardon you, right? Is that not how your guys' story goes? That's how it goes in my mind. And he's saying, don't be there. Don't be angry. Don't meditate. Don't focus. And then he even gives you somewhat of a progression, because anger will lead to insulting. And if you insult, there's going to be a condition of the council, the religious council. So in that community, you're going to have to address that. But he's saying, But even then, your anger leads to insulting, and it goes even further to where it actually could damage and threaten your relationship with God, because he says, for the person who says you're a brother a fool, or then translation raka, it's an insult. The person who says that, he says, you might even be danger of hellfire. And what Jesus is addressing, he's saying, guys, you have to examine the condition of your heart. And he goes even deeper, says, verse 23, so if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Now this is profound, because what he's talking about, if you don't understand this, this is the Jewish culture. If you sinned against God, you had to go and make a sacrifice at the temple so that you can be reconciled with God. So what Jesus just said is, if you are in that moment where you're focused on your relationship with God and you want to be okay with God and be reconciled, and in that moment you realize there's tension between you and someone else in a relationship, Jesus, who is God speaking for God, says, it is actually more important that you focus on your relationship first before you even focus on your relationship with God. And the reason I believe this is so powerful is Jesus taught the same thing in prayer. He said, when you're praying, note this. If you don't forgive other people of their sins against you, God won't forgive you. He's saying this is conditional forgiveness, is that you have to make sure you forgive others before you receive grace from God. And in this moment, he's saying the same thing. Think about your relationships. Think about the condition of your heart. Think about how you're responding to others. And then he says it another way, because Jesus is telling us that we have a choice. In verse 38, so this is all one sermon. He says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Now think about it. This is true 2,000 years ago. The religious leaders taught them that, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But isn't this, if there is ever a statement that summarizes our belief now in our culture, it'd be that statement. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Someone comes against you, you come against them. You meet their evil and kind. He says, guys, you've heard it said, this is good, this is true, this is right. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. This next statement is one that you're like, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. What? And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. And truthfully, I don't have time to teach this. There's other context to this. But let me just summarize it. Here's what Jesus is simply saying. Do not become the evil that's being inflicted on you. The mentality that we would have is, you smack me in the cheek, you're getting smacked back. You want to sue me, I'm going to sue you. You want me to go 1 mile, I'm going to say no, I'm going to defend myself. And Jesus is saying to him, there's actually a better way. And here's the better way. Someone smacks you, don't return evil for evil. Show them grace. Turn your cheek. If someone wants to sue you, whether it's justified or unjustified, don't be the person that always has to defend yourself. Trust in God to be your defender. Someone wants you to go 1 mile, be generous, be extravagant in your service of other people. And Jesus is giving a perspective that we can all agree, this is not intuitive. This is not what we naturally do. We hear this, and here's what I'm guessing. I don't want to embarrass you. I want to do a show of hands. But I'm guessing, as I'm teaching right now, you are applying this to the relationships in your life that have tension. And you're thinking, dude, what? That person smacks me, I promise you they're getting smacked back. That person wants to do that, and you're trying to process through, and Jesus saying, just think, there's a different, better way. And he goes on in the same message, same sermon, he says, you have heard that it was said. Again, this would have been the religious leaders saying this. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And this is what they taught. If you're a Jew, you love the Jews, you protect your own, you hate everyone else. He says, but I'm going to give you a new perspective. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And love is not an emotion in this situation. We've studied this recently. Love is a commitment to the betterment of other people. So Jesus goes, there are going to be people that are your enemies. They're going to set themselves up against you. That's going to be their motivation. That's going to be their behavior. That's going to be how they think about you. And he says, but I want you to respond not in kind. I want you to respond by being committed to their betterment. And someone wants to come against you, they want to spread lies about you, they want to persecute you. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to pray for them. Not pray God's judgment on them, but pray for God to change their hearts, God to bless them, God to do a work in their life. We look at this and we think, wow, this is so hard. So how does this happen? Well, it begins in the heart. In Luke chapter 6, verse 43, Jesus acknowledged this powerful principle. He says, for no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. I love it. Just a simple analogy, but so profound. He goes, here's the way that you judge if a tree is healthy. You look at its fruit. Healthy fruit, healthy tree. Unhealthy fruit, unhealthy tree. He says, this is really common sense. We get that. Same thing is true of our lives. Our behavior is our fruit. And so he goes on and says, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. And the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. And then another way that Jesus worded in Mark 7:20, and Jesus said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, and he's about to list a bunch of sins, he says, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality. This is any type of sex outside of the context of a marriage. Theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Here's what Jesus was simply saying. Your heart is going to determine your actions and your behavior. The 3 points I've already given you, he says, you determine the condition of your heart and mind. You have the choice of how you're going to respond when evil is inflicted on you. And the truth is, it begins in your mind and heart. Because you need to hear me on this as I say this. Your internal character will eventually become your outward behavior, right? How you think, what you dwell on will eventually become the behavior in your life. You have to choose how you respond. And when someone does wrong to you, you have to choose, are you going to meditate on that wrong? Are you going to think about it? Are you going to play it over and over in your head? Because here's what naturally happens, and I think all of us have experienced this. How many of you have ever been frustrated or angry at a person, and then every little thing they do annoys you? You guys know what I'm talking about? Like, someone else can look at them and go like, that's not that big of a deal. And you're like, oh, it's a big deal. And the reason it's a big deal to you is the lens that you're looking through is their past mistakes, their past failures, their past evil they've inflicted on you. So that's the lens you're looking at a person. So as a result, your relationship has no chance to ever be healthy. And this is what Jesus is acknowledging. Guys, are you in your own heart going to learn to give grace, to release people? Or are you going to meditate on it and dwell on it and just play it over and over and so it becomes bigger and bigger so that that person has no chance to ever reconcile with you? And so what we have to acknowledge is what we think about matters, what we dwell on matters, what we choose to remember matters. But the other flip side of this is equally true, is not only does your inward character eventually become your outward behavior, but that's true the other way too. Your outward behavior will eventually become your inward character. So then the question is, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The answer is yes. Yes, I mean, sometimes it's your behavior that shapes your character. Sometimes it's the inside that shapes the outside. But as we get into this cycle, it becomes who we are. And so your outward behavior, if you get in the habit of every single person who does wrong to you, that you have to address it, that will become your character. Every single conflict has to be met in the same way or greater. That will be who you are. And for some of you, even as I say this, you know this is who you are. You're that person that's constantly looking for a fight. Here's how you won't view it that way. What you'll view it as, everyone in your life is aggressive, everyone else lets you down, everyone else is a failure. You'll view yourself as a victim, but the truth is that you have taken a posture where you believe the sword is best. That if someone's going to draw a sword, I'm going to draw a sword. And what Jesus is saying is there's actually a better way to operate and to live. And so if you have that mindset, if you want to fight, I'll fight. You want to speak ill against me, I'll speak ill against you. You want to be angry, I'll be angry. You want to gossip, I'll gossip. You want to do something wrong to me, you want to pull out the sword, I will pull out the sword. If that's you, then you're going to perpetually live in a condition where your heart gets harder and harder, angrier and angrier. And the truth is, and I think you probably realize this, is you cannot choose to operate in one relationship that way and in other relationships not that way. Eventually, the hard heart of one relationship will become the hard heart of every relationship in your life. And this is what Jesus is addressing. He's saying you can dwell on someone's failures and make that the lens you view them. You can meet anger for anger and evil for evil. Or, and this is what he's saying, or you can choose to give grace. Someone makes a mistake. Someone lets you down, intentional, unintentional, and you can choose in that moment to go, I'm going to give them grace. I'm going to release them in that moment. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm not going to bring that up the next argument we have. I'm not even going to address it. I'm going to release it because I know in this moment what they need is grace. You can, or instead of being aggressive, you can say, you know what, you're going to be angry with me. I'm going to be graceful with you. You're going to be evil to me. I'm going to show you love. You're going to be impatient. I'm going to be patient. You're going to be stingy. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to choose to operate in the way that Jesus operated with me. And when we do this, in this moment, it starts to change our heart. It changes our behavior. And it becomes the tool that God uses to impact other people's lives. And I know this because it's been true in my own life. An example that I've shared maybe with you before. A couple of years ago, I was on vacation with my family. And while we're on vacation, I had some stress that was going on in my life. Some of it was related to the church, and it was just something I was thinking about all the time, and it was putting me in a bad mood, honestly. So we're on vacation, and this one day, from morning till night, I was in a bad mood. And I knew I was in a bad mood. I was short. I was just frustrated the entire day, and yet the entire day, Mary was showing me grace, kind to me, going out of her way. And we know each other well enough that we can read each other's body language. Not one time the entire day did her body language say that she was annoyed with me, even though I knew I was grumpy, or I was a jerk. We can say that. I was a jerk. At the end of that day at night, I remember sitting down and just saying to her, thank you. Thank you today for being so nice to me, even though I was in a bad mood. And I just remember she said, it's okay. I just knew you were having a bad day. In that moment, throughout the day, she didn't choose to dwell on my jerkness. She didn't choose to dwell on that and make that the lens through which she was viewing my behavior. She didn't choose to hold on to that, to hammer me over the head with it. She looked at my situation and said, Matt needs grace. Matt needs love, not anger right now. And so in that moment, it just touched my heart. And I wish I could say, and from that moment on, I've never been grumpy again. But you know the truth? A couple of days later, same vacation, I was grumpy again. And I was still thinking about the things, and this exact same thing. And I remember that evening, having this conversation with Mary where I went, I know I just apologized about this 2 days ago, but I'm sorry once again that I was that way today. And she said, it's okay. And I just remember, this happened a couple years ago, and it still impacts me today that I think about the love and grace that was shown me. What we realize in our lives is that's the better way. And this is what Jesus is challenging the audience and what he was challenging Peter in that moment. You can choose to meet the sword with the sword, or you can choose another way. And what Jesus was showing us is that Jesus' way is better. It's better. It's better than what's natural to us. It's better than what our culture models for us. And you know who it's better for first? It's better for you. Do you know that Jesus cares about your heart? Let me ask you a question. You don't need to respond. You can just, a rhetorical question here. How many of you have ever had a season where your heart was hurt and therefore it was angry and you had unforgiveness? I want you to think about that season. In the first service, people actually raised their hand. It was almost an entire room. I want you to think about that season. Maybe some of you are in that right now. Do you feel like you're living life at its best when you're in that season? Is that when life feels good to you? It doesn't. And do you know Jesus wants you to have life at its best? So though we look at it and think, well, there's no other way, Jesus said, no, there's another way. And if you will release and choose not to hold anger, you choose to forgive, choose to release, Jesus is saying, this is actually best for you. But do you know who else it's best for? It's best for him or her, whoever the other person is in the relationship. Because here's something we have to acknowledge. Do you know if someone is evil to you? Do you know why they're evil? Because they're broken. Something has hurt them. Something has damaged them. Maybe it's just the sin of their lives, their own selfishness, but maybe there's a backstory. Maybe it's their upbringing. Maybe someone wounded them in the past. We don't know. But the last thing a person who's being evil needs is to be met with the sword, to be met with evil. What they need instead is someone to live in such a shockingly different way that it shows them a better option. What they need is love, and what they need is grace. This is why Jesus was able to impact so many and still impacts people today, is because he doesn't meet our evilness with evil. He meets our brokenness and our sin with love and compassion. The reason why billions of people now have hope in a relationship with God is because Jesus didn't give us what we deserved. Instead, what he gave us is grace and love. And it was so radically different than what we understand and embrace and deserve that it got our attention and it changed our lives. And he's saying, when you show people that type of love, it's best for them. And then lastly, what it's best for is your relationship. If you have any hope of reconciliation, any hope of being a blessing and to be connected again, this is the way that you have to operate. Jesus' method can heal your relationship. And I'll just say something kind of blunt here. Some of us will push back, and I get that. And you know why we push back? Because we feel vulnerable. The idea of not defending ourselves seems so vulnerable. But how will they know their mistakes? If I don't pout, how will they know the consequence? How will they know how they're hurting me? How will they ever change? I mean, my pouting and my aggressiveness and my harsh words, I am a tool, an instrument for God to show them their ways, right? I mean, we might not use those terminologies, but that's what we're thinking. How can they ever be changed if I don't do my part? Well, here's what I'd say to you. This sounds like I'm being a smart aleck. I'm not. Is your method working? I mean, we do it over and over for year after year, but is that method working? Is meeting the sword with a sword, does that work? Is anyone really thankful when their friend or their spouse meets your sword with a sword? No one is. It doesn't work. And so what Jesus is saying is, if you will trust him, his way is different, but his way works. And what this story powerfully illustrates is that even though we feel vulnerable, there's really a powerful dynamic going on. And here's what this story illustrates. Peter, he looked strong, but he was weak. I mean, he looked strong in the story. He's the one holding the sword. He's the one swinging it. He's the one chopping off the ear. He looked like he was nice and strong. But the truth is, he was weak. He didn't change the situation at all. Jesus looked weak, but was strong. Jesus is the one who took the ear, placed it back on his head, and healed him. Jesus is the one who surrendered his life and looked weak. But through what Jesus did, his sacrifice, his gift, Jesus reconciled humanity back to God. Jesus' method brought healing and restoration and reconciliation. Peter's method brought nothing. And the same thing in our lives. We can think we are strong because we can fight. We can think we look strong because we can meet evil for evil. But the true strength is the person who says, I'm going to trust God and his method and his spirit to be a part of me and my relationship. And when we do that, it is the Spirit of God that makes us strong, and it is the Spirit of God that brings reconciliation and restoration to our relationships. So here's the question. Jesus, his words, those who live by the sword, die by the sword. Is that going to be the method that we use? Are we going to meet evil for evil? Or are we going to meet evil with love and compassion and grace? Let me pray. God, I thank you so much that you have modeled for us a dramatically different way to live. But here's what I know. I'm very sympathetic to the fact that in this room, there are many men and women who have been hurt. Many men and women who have had people who they are close to let them down, hurt them, and wound them. I know that there's legitimate anger and frustration and fear in this room. But here's what I also know. You are able. You are able to heal. You are able to empower. You are able to give supernatural wisdom. And you are able to reconcile. So what I'm asking, Lord, is that you will be with every person here, that you will bring healing to their wounded hearts. You will give them wisdom on what to say, what not to say. You will empower them to resist the temptation of their flesh to meet evil for evil. And the reason we want to do this is, first and foremost, we want to honor you because this is how you relate to us. But we also want to do this because we believe it's best for us, best for those we're in relationship with, and best for the relationship itself. So, Lord, I'm asking for you to do a mighty work, and here's what I'm believing for. I'm believing that there'll be relationships restored in this room, that parents and children will begin to talk again, and brothers and sisters will begin to communicate, and husbands and wives will get back together. and friends will start the process of reconciliation. I'm believing because I believe your word is true. Thank you, Lord, for teaching us and encouraging us. Thank you for giving us your spirit to empower us. And we pray all this in your mighty name. Amen.